And welcome back to Brockhouse, here on the campus of Pepperdine University. And I'm delighted to welcome you back here for the third in our three-part series titled, What the Ancients Taught the Founders. Throughout this series, we've been exploring the impact and influence that both the examples of the ancient cities of Rome, Athens, and Sparta, but also the philosophers and philosophies of that period had on the American founding. As we approach America's 250th anniversary, it's important to understand that while some think the American founding happened as a miracle in Philadelphia, actually there was a lot of work and thinking that went back centuries and even millennia to draw from earlier examples and philosophies that helped to shape documents like our Declaration of Independence, Constitution, and the very founding itself. Who better to lead us through this conversation than our Giles O'Malley Distinguished Senior Fellow, Dr. Victor Davis Hanson. Dr. Hanson?
Thank you.
So in this third session, as we wrap up this series, I wanted to look at the understanding of and definition of citizenship. This, of course, was a very important factor in the design of our Constitution, how our founders understood the role of citizens versus the government. As colonies of Great Britain, they were known as subjects, and so there was a dramatic shift from being known as a subject to a citizen. And in that transition, the founders often referenced these very ancient times of the roles of citizens in places like Athens and Rome. So to set the table for this discussion, I wondered if you could explore and describe how a citizen was understood in Athens, Rome, and Sparta.
Well, it's a very late concept in the history of civilization. There's no concept in Egypt or Samaria, Syria, the Persian Empire. So most people, if you ask them what was their status under King Darius or under the Pharaoh, it was either a subject, a slave, a resident alien, or just a mere resident. But it was not somebody who had clearly defined privileges and responsibilities. That starts in Greece around 650 to 700 with the rise of the city-state. And it's tied and indistinguishable from consensual government. So the idea is the citizens are going to vote for either directly as in a democracy like Athens for laws, or in a moderate oligarchy and later the Roman Republic for representatives. But then the question arose, well, what if somebody just moves in here and they're not accustomed to our religion, our customs, our traditions, but they see that we're a dynamic Athens. So this is a very relevant issue. And so the Greeks said we're going to give them a green card, basically, and they called it metoikoi, people who oikos, who've changed their house or their residence. The problem with it was that each of these 1,500 city-states was based on exclusivity, that you're within a particular terrain, place, culture, you have a particular patron goddess, the Argives, the Spartans, the Athenians, all have separate branches of Olympian religion. And they also have a disdain for what they would call, I guess we would call mercantilism, middlemanism. They were emphasis on landed aristocracy or the hoplite middle-class farmer. But people who were transient had greater skills. They understood the harbor, or they understood shipping, or they were the people in charge. And so these metoikoi, green card holders, were resident aliens. And they had to register in most city-states, but they couldn't vote. So it was okay as long as they were not a large percentage, but in Athens there were, of the 100,000 actual citizens, and we're talking about male adults.
Right.
And everybody will say, well, this is very sexist. It was, but that male adult just didn't vote on a whim. He represented the interest of his household. So he had a lot, I mean, that's where we get these stories that Socrates was henpecked, or women had too inordinate influence on Pericles, Aspasia. So the metoikos could not vote, and when they got to be a large and important part of the economy, and yet they had no, you can see there's going to be a disconnect.
Right.
And that was part of the problem with the entire city-state system, that you had 1,500 different definitions of citizenship superimposed with a huge group of very skilled Athenians that might be working in Argos, or Corinthians that might be in Thebes, but not citizens. So when Rome looked at the system that they inherited, the first movement in the 3rd and 2nd centuries BC was the unification of Italy, Greek city-states, Etruscan city-states, Latinate city-states under the aegis of Rome. And they had the social wars of the early 1st century. But then they created this idea of civis Romanus, that you were going to give citizenship, Roman citizenship, to people whose native language might have been in Croton Greek or an Etruscan, early Etruscan. And by the 1st century BC, it had worked very effectively. Then the empire spread, and the problems kept popping up. And what made Rome dynamic is they began to predicate citizenship not on your superficial appearance, your dialect, your particular religion, or your ancestry in a particular locale. And that allowed them to incorporate into the body politic people based on merit all over the empire. And by the 3rd century AD, the Emperor Caracalla just said, we're broke. So anybody who's these Greek, Roman version of medics, transients, they're going to have to pay taxes, and therefore they're going to be Roman citizens. 70 million people probably. But one of the dynamic aspects of Roman citizenship was it could incorporate people. So when the founders looked at all this, they understood that 95% of the original inhabitants in the colonial period and in the early American Republic were males originally as citizenship, landowners, and mostly British or Northern Europeans. And they had a slave population, mostly in the South, but very few others. But they realized, and they had written documents where the word slave was only mentioned one time in the Constitution, and it was a compromise with the Southern slave owners. They said, well, you're hypocritical because you won't give them citizenship, but for purposes of the House of Representatives, you want them to count in the census. Right. So they said, okay, we'll only count 3/5.
Right.
Well, today people say, well, the United States was founded on the idea that we didn't think a black person was a full citizen. No, the people in the North did. Right. But they did not want to give inordinate power to the South in the House of Representatives to get more slaves and oppress black people. Right. So actually, in a weird, paradoxical way, it was an effort to stop slavery or to diminish its importance. But the other problem they realized, when you say all men are created equal, and there's nothing in the Constitution about a national religion or a national race, they understood that their system would be very dynamic, and that people were going to come in from all over the world, and it happened very quickly. And so they had to, in the states, were having different types of citizenship. So then they began to pass laws about citizenship. The Supreme Court would weigh in, 14th Amendment. But they kind of got to the point where after the 19th century, it was kind of chaotic because there were these new territories, the border was fluid, people were going back and forth. But by the end of the 19th and early 20th, they had codified a system that would allow people to come in the United States and and this was what was really radical about it. It was a Roman, they would have the same powers or privileges as somebody who came over, family had come over in the Mayflower. And that's a strong American tradition. There was a lot of opposition. They would say, well, my family's been here 6 generations. They fought in the Revolutionary War. They fought with Jackson. This guy's coming in from Germany, and he doesn't speak our English very well. He's a radical Lutheran or something, and he just hangs around with Germans. And so there was a great problem. That was the Teddy Roosevelt's idea of basically, I do not like hyphenated Americans. And he created that term melting pot.
Right.
And so, but it's a dynamic idea, and you can see from Silicon Valley today that 50% of the CEOs were foreign born.
Now, on that note, the powers, at least in Rome, and their understanding of citizenship, what were the typical privileges that one would have as a Roman citizen?
Well, you could vote in your region. There was something like the states. Each of these cities had municipal representative government, and you could vote. And then if you were also a member of the Senate, the census. Later, people who were not citizens were incorporated into the legions, but you were expected to fight for Rome as part of your responsibility. You were expected to vote in the tribunal councils, and you were subject to protections under the law, most importantly, habeas corpus. So a Roman citizen could not be held without a formal indictment and court hearing. And that was very important because it applied to everybody. So Cicero, who was consul of Rome, but he had indicted Catiline, another Roman citizen, for insurrection. And he knew that the Catilinian conspiracy transcended the leader, and it was growing. So once they arrested Catiline, he immediately said, and he got the support of some of the most powerful people, although not Caesar, that this man should be executed. So they executed him without a trial. And there was such an outrage after the immediate threat of insurrection passed that he was exiled, Cicero of all people. So he had to go out to Asia Minor because he had ordered the execution of someone who was a Roman citizen, as awful as Catiline was, without a trial. So you have to have a trial to be sentenced or executed, and you had certain rights as a Roman citizen that your person was protected from apprehension. So Cicero later in the Pro Archia, it's the most famous speech about citizenship. Archius the poet has been in Rome, in Italy, and his patron is the famous Lucellus, the great general. And they don't like him because he's so powerful and rich. So the Pompeians want to punish him by taking away his favorite poet who hangs around with Lucellus. And they say, well, he's not on the Roman census. Or he could have registered for the census in his Heraclea, a Roman city, but he didn't. Or you have to live in a Roman city, and he doesn't even live in Rome. And then Cicero makes this argument, well, the records were burned up, or he was in another census, or actually he has a house in Rome. But they're arguing because Archius really does want to be a Roman citizen because he can travel all over the world without fear that somebody is going to arrest him or say, we don't like what you say, we're going to put you in jail. So it was a covenant. And in that dialogue, Cicero explains that once you say, civis Romanus sum, I am a Roman citizen, just the mere sound of it makes people back off. You do not want to touch a Roman citizen. So there was a sense of exclusivity.
And I think it's fair to say that certainly from the ancient examples taken to the founding, there was always this understanding that in being a citizen, there were not only rights, but also responsibilities. Yes. And so talk a little bit about that dual-headed nature of citizenship.
If you were a Roman citizen, and again, the Emperor Caracalla in 216, 212 AD, he made people citizens so they would have the responsibility to pay taxes. That was number one. And the legions were diminished, so if you were a Roman citizen, you were subject, at least in the late, up until the early empire, you were subject to serve for 16 years in some cases. Sometimes you were volunteered, sometimes you were drafted. The problem was that as citizenship started to be diluted over 70 million people, it was de jure rather than de facto. And this is a good lesson for us. The Greeks were too exclusive, the Romans were too fluid. And so they had open borders, so to speak, or they incorporated different peoples. And by the 3rd century or even earlier, if you were a legionnaire on the Rhine protecting Italy from Germany or on the Danube, and they ordered you, let's say there's a crisis in North Africa, you've got to get on a ship and go over the 12th Legion, they wouldn't do it. And when we look at their letters, they can barely read Latin, and they're speaking German, and they're violating the rules that legionnaires cannot be married. And now it's pretty much becoming a mercenary force. So it got to the point where the emperors were mostly from Spain or North Africa, and the Italian, agrarian, Virgilian influence on Rome started to fade. And so by the 3rd or 4th century AD, if you were in Antioch, or you were in Alexandria, or you were in Thessaloniki by the 4th century, the new city of Constantinople, that's where the wealth was, that was where the power was, that's where Greek was not the official but the actual language, that's where science, that was more dynamic. And they didn't feel an allegiance any longer after Diocletian to Rome, and they didn't feel an allegiance to Latinity. They felt that, and it started to break apart. And then we would have the Byzantine survival and the Western collapse.
I wanted to move now to a discussion about, we've been talking about the rights and responsibilities, the examples of ancient citizenship, how it tied to the founders' understanding. But there's also a kind of a corollary around civic virtue, how citizens were supposed to behave and understand their affiliation to their mother country. As we have throughout this series, we're going to draw from a few different readings that you've suggested. All of those readings, by the way, are linked in your YouTube program description, so feel free to access those. One is from the historian Edwin Miles, in which he writes this, and I wanted to get your reflections on it. Quote, "The emulation of the heroic virtues of classical antiquity may have aided the American cause during the war, for the conflict stimulated respect not only for those ancient writers and orators who had extolled personal freedom and self-government, but also for those Greek and Roman heroes who had displayed bravery, patriotism, fortitude, and perseverance."
Yes.
So talk a bit about the civic virtues and qualities that were also expected.
Well, the founders in the early republic, their knowledge of a man of virtue and a man that led fellow citizens militarily and politically was for the most part either from Plutarch or from vignettes that came out of Thucydides. So the locus classicus is Pericles, the famous funeral oration over this second year dead of the war. And he says, this is what we are as Athenians. And all of us Athenian citizens are very unique people. And we're virtuous in that we don't judge people with harsh looks. And we value art and literature, and yet we're not, this is very controversial, and yet we're not feminized. The word he uses, malakia, is a root, means softness. We're not soft. So we're not, and the subtext is contrasting Sparta.
Right.
And yet when we have to fight, we're just as good fighters as the Spartans because we do it by volition and a desire to fill our hearts with love of this city. And then there's an appeal to generations. And we have a responsibility as citizens, after inheriting this wonderful commonwealth, to add to it, to beautify it, and to pass it on better than what we got. And so it's tragic because right after the oration, the plague hits. But it's sort of the classic. Because the other thing is that Plutarch, who wrote about 100, had access to all of these historians 400 or 500 years later. So he wrote the parallel lives. I'm going to give you a Demosthenes of the Greeks, and I'm going to give you a Cicero. I'm going to give you an Alexander the Great and a Caesar, and you can see how each culture produced in the same field luminaries, and obviously because he's a Roman citizen, but he's Greek, he's trying to tell fellow Romans, actually, we're lucky that our legacy started in Greece from my people, because they started this tradition, and you've only expanded on it.
Right.
But when you look at the people he chooses, it's very funny because if I say something like Epaminondas, no one knows who he is. But people say that he was the first Greek, or he was the most famous Greek that they could think of in Roman times. And he was a Theban general who overthrew the oligarchy with his friend Pelopidas and created a broad-based oligarchy, or maybe a constitutional democracy in Thebes. And then he used that dynamism to go march into the Peloponnese, into midwinter, to liberate the Helots, the indentured servants of Sparta, and to ruin the Spartan system, because they required indentured servants to do their work so then they could train for war full time. Right. Then he went over to the city-state of Messenia, and he freed the Messenian Helots. And then he built these he was in charge of building these big democratic cities at Messenia, at Megalopolis, at Mantia, to circle Sparta in. So he was really, if we could go back in time and ask ourselves who was the most virtuous leader and who represented democracy and the power of consensual government and free will to destroy oligarchy or aristocracy, it was Epaminondas. And the founders knew him very well, and so did George Patton talked about him. But today, I think part of it is that we know in the Renaissance, one of the most popular lives of all was the life of Epaminondas, and it was lost. So we don't have it today. So we don't have any description. And Xenophon, the historian who wrote during this period, hated his guts because he was a Theban, so he does not mention him by name. So he writes about the Battle of Leuctra, where Epaminondas crushed the beloved Spartans, but he doesn't mention his name once.
Well, I think that's actually a great segue into the use of these historic examples of civic virtue, both in leadership and in citizenship, as a way of promoting a certain type of, if you will, civic participation, or an example or expectation. In one of another passage from the Edwin Miles reading, Miles quotes North Carolina Senator Bedford Brown, who said in the early 1800s, quote, "History gives to Cincinnatus high civic virtues, to Aristides the quality of justice, and to Fabius Maximus consummate prudence and courage in war." And of course, George Washington was often compared to Cincinnatus. Talk a little bit about these historic examples.
And all of those names, Aristides the Just, Fabius Maximus, George Washington, they all have one thing in common. They took power reluctantly, and they didn't hold on to it. Cincinnatus is famous because he was a farmer, and he comes to save Rome, and then he goes back.
Right.
Fabius Maximus delayed the cunctator. One man Livy said, by delaying, that is kind of guerrilla warfare, defeated Hannibal, or saved what he called the Republic. And Washington drew on to that idea that he was reluctant to be president. He only served 2 terms. He didn't want to be a king, and then he voluntarily gave up power. And so what in the ancient world is the definition of a virtuous leader or a virtuous citizen. The virtuous leader is moderate. He's not self-aggrandizing. He sacrifices for the republic. He is adept in civic matters, oratory, rhetoric, as he is in military matters. But he's not a militarist. He's not just a general, and he's not just a windbag. He's both. And there's a lot of people that tried to do both and could not. Crassus, for example, was an orator and he was a triumvir, but when he was a general, he destroyed his army in Parthia. And so, and that reflected the larger early Italian agrarian idea of what was a virtuous citizen. Virtue was considered, as Aristotle said, very important for citizenship. And that was somebody who served on juries, did his municipal service, was drafted into the legions, voted, but he didn't hang around what the Greeks would call the marketplace or the agora. In Aristophanes, there's a word agora lounger. And these are people who they're urban, they're unemployed, they're working for government, and they want their obol to go, they got paid. Finally, in the 4th century, you were paid in Athens to vote. But they were paid to go to the theater, they were paid to be on juries. And so that was considered in the conservative idea of most classical literature that you want to be independent. You don't want to work for someone else, and you don't want to have a lot of employees. Your family is going to be self-sustaining. You're going to go to town and do all the things required of you, but you're not going to be enamored with urban life. And you're going to be moderate in your own life. And so you don't eat too much, you don't eat too little. You don't sleep too much, you don't sleep too little. You drink alcohol, but very sparingly. You don't become publicly drunk. And so it was the idea of what they called the golden mean. And on the Temple of Apollo at Delphi, on one side it says, know yourself, nothe se auton, and then maiden leon or megan agon, nothing too much. And that sums up the idea of moderation. And that, when you read the pessimistic literature of the late Roman Republic and early Roman Empire, and I'm talking about Suetonius's Lives of the 12 Caesars, Petronius's novel, The Satyricon, Catullus's poems about randy life in Rome, Tacitus's Annals, talking about the period from 50 BC to 100 AD. The common theme of all those authors, juvenile satires, perhaps the best, is that we have destroyed the idea of virtue. That, and almost every modern excess is in there. Romans drink too much. Women are not staying home and having children. They're too promiscuous. People are spending too much money on food and makeup. Sexual ambiguity. The big theme is transgenderism. It's severely criticized, at least in the poem of Catullus and in the Satyricon. Male feminism or effeminate, gambling. All of these things are considered a betrayal of classical virtue that led to citizenship, and they're a result of the empire, the growing empire, bringing in slaves and money from the outer rich Greek-speaking and Northern European provinces. And the idea is that we've been utterly corrupted. We're not planting grain and olive trees. We're just making these huge estates around Naples of wine, viticulture, just for wine. We're dependent on grain from Egypt or North Africa. So the idea is that we can't be citizens, we can't be self-governed anymore because the citizenry is no good. It's a slave to their appetites. And that was a theme that, of course, Livy says we can't live with our sins and we can't live with the remedies. because the medicine is worse than the disease, because it would shock us to go back to be like Fabius Maximus or Cincinnatus.
Related to that, and you've touched on it, but I do think it's worth maybe drilling down on a bit, is the founders were, whether it's in the Federalist Papers or certainly in the debates around the Constitution, deeply fearful of corruption, the corruption of leaders. And there were a number of references back to ancient times and the corruption,
Yes.
not so much of the citizenship or the citizenry, but of the leaders themselves. And wondered if you could talk a little bit about either specific examples or this concern that within the freedoms afforded by a republic, there could be a tendency towards corruption in leadership.
I can't think of a major figure in antiquity that wasn't accused of corruption. Even Cicero was. Pericles was. But most of the charges of corruption have a particular context. So the Spartans are agrarian, insular, parochial people. After the Peloponnesian War, when they defeat Athens, they inherit that sphere of influence, and they go to Persia. And sure enough, they take Persian gold, and they wear fancy robes, and they're no longer... Spartans had big lead and iron ingots, mostly iron, so big you couldn't carry it because they distrusted the power of money. And in Athens, almost every politician is corrupt, taking money. So they had these institutions where if I say Pete Peterson's corrupt and I'm a citizen and you're an official, I go up and tap you on the head and I'm going to indict you as a citizen, kind of like a citizen's arrest. But if I fail, there was something called antidosis. You get my money, and if I succeed and find you corrupt, I get your money. So that it was a self-policing there, and there was ostracism.
Yeah.
So 6,000 to 7,000 people in any given year could vote to ostracize. So Themistocles was ostracized, Aristides was ostracized, and it was always on the charge that he's corrupt. But basically, it was anybody who was too important, too high profile. They thought it was good for the body politic to bring them down. And in Rome, you get charges of corruption, but in Republican literature, it starts to excel as the empire expands. And it's a symptom that the East is much wealthier. That's where the slaves are, and that's where people who can be enslaved are. That's where the mines are mostly. That's where the food is. That's where the trade routes to India and China are. And so when they conquer Carthage, the triumph is just overwhelming when they destroy the city in the third. We have a good description of it. They just have all of this gold enslaved. Caesar, when he conquers in 9 years Gaul, modern France and Belgium, brings in 1 million slaves, we're told by Plutarch. And so all of them are corrupt because it's just too much money. So the idea in Roman and Greek morality is that we're all subject to that. And most people, despite the philosophical and religious impulses that we have that are good, can't resist the temptation. So poverty, a genteel poverty, is considered the ideal. Not being wealthy. And I think that had a strong effect on the United States, because although the founders were aristocrats and knew about they were well read, they did imbue this idealization of agrarianism. And you just don't talk about yourself. You don't show your wealth. You control your appetites in public. You're governed by a shame culture rather than a guilt. I can remember, I think I'm the 5th generation living in the same house. And my grandfather was born in the same house in 1890, died in 1976. His grandmother came in 1871. But he would always say to me in high school and to my brothers, if you go to town, I don't want to see a cigarette hanging out of your mouth. I don't want to hear that you're drinking. If you see a bunch of kids that are shoplifting, you've got to speak up. But he never said you, and he didn't say, because that's a sin or you're going to feel guilty. It was, can you imagine what people would think of our family? Because when you have a family that's stuck in the same place and everybody knows you, then you can disgrace, and that's a very classical idea that the founders had. And I think that's why Americans never had an aristocracy. At least they had a plutocracy, but not a landed aristocracy. And even today, when you go to Europe and you're there long enough and you give lectures or you meet people, you're asked questions that you never are here. If I go places, nobody's ever said to me, well, who were your parents? What did your father do?
Right.
Did you own land? Over there, I hear that all the time. Who are your parents? Tell me about your family. Because our idea is that we don't want to talk about if we were aristocrats or if we had money, but we want to kind of, I know that they say Americans are brash and confident, but actually you can see it in our political ideology. The other day, Gavin Newsom was telling everybody, he grew up very affluent. He was I guess he was a client in the Roman sense of the Getty family. Right. His father was an appellate court judge. My mother was an appellate court judge and knew him. So, but he was talking as if he ate Wonder Bread and was poor.
Macaroni and cheese, and that's
Elizabeth
how he
Warren doesn't tell us that she flipped houses and she's a Harvard law professor. Right. But she had a cookbook of Native American. Everybody wants the log cabin. Tim Waltz does that. Yeah. And it's not confined to Democrats or Republicans.
Right.
Everybody wants that. And nobody says, I'm a scion of a billionaire family. And that was what was so fascinating about Donald Trump. He kind of turned the American ideal upside down. Said, I have all this money and I must be good because I made it. Right. And we would have said that's arrogant. But the idea of middle-class agrarianism came from the founders. And you can really see Crevecoeur, early writer, Tocqueville, they all said that America will make it where we didn't with consensual government because they depend on the middle class being larger than the wealthy and the poor. That is a very classical idea because in classical literature the message is the poor are too dependent on government or rich people, and they don't have freedom of choice, and they're not autonomous. Yeah. The wealthy have too much temptation to get bribes or to use their power to influence government that is not in the interest of the body politic. Right. But the middle class are independent. They don't need government like the poor, and they don't have enough money to influence politicians or get special privileges.
You know, I'm struck, Victor, and it's certainly of that classical era, the apostle Paul, in defining contentment, and he was a Roman citizen and claimed citizen rights and privileges at one point.
And it helped him a lot, too.
It did. But at one point, he defines at least a contributing factor to contentment is not having too much or too little. Yes. So this middle-class ethos is very much a classical concept that was taken by the founders. I thought to close us out here, Victor, we've been obviously over the course of this three-part series been looking at the influence of antiquity on the founders. At one point in our first episode in the series, we were talking about the importance of education and how a classical education was very much dominant at the time of the founding, and that many of the founders knew Latin and Greek and certainly not only understood the language, but also understood the history. It could be said in academia today that we are seeing a decline not only of study of the classics, but also study of the humanities. And as we think about our next generation of leaders, obviously we try to incorporate these some of these elements into the policy school at Pepperdine, but wondered if you could speak from your perspective as a classicist who has taught in academia, taught with us at Pepperdine, about why this is happening and what is being lost as we think about the future of the country.
When we speak about humanities, we're talking essentially about the study, formal study in the university of languages, literature, history, which is not a social science, it really is a humane discipline, art, architecture, rhetoric, oratory, so coming from the medieval triumvirate, the tripart and four-part study. Okay. And that the idea when we founded these universities, and it would trickle down to K through 12 as well, was that these are the only methods that we inherited over time that are tested. And if you read the Odyssey, or you speak a little French, or you took Latin, or you took a class in art history, or you took a history of Western Civ, or humanities of the Western world, then you received about 3 unique gifts that were essential to being a good citizen. One, by reading these great writers and developing an aesthetic sense, you would be able to have reference. So you would know, as I said earlier, what a Doric column was. You could look at the Treasury Department and see, well, that's you know what neoclassical meant. Or you could look at your own currency and knew what so you were acquainted with your culture. The numbers 2 is you, especially from Plato and Aristotle, rhetoric, oratory, philosophy, you learn the inductive, not the deductive method. So you looked at examples, and then you said, this thing has hooves, I see another person has horns, another person has a tail, so there must be an animal that has both hooves and a tail and horns. Oh, we'll call it a cow. You don't just say, I think I'll make an imaginary creature called a cow, and I'll just try to say you are that, the opposite. We're not deductive. And that can only come from courses in logic and rhetoric and philosophy. And then I think third is, and I think this is very important, that you learn to write well and to speak well through study of grammar and syntax, and you get an aesthetic sense as well from art. And that can affect your entire life, the way you decorate your home, what type of car you buy, how you explain yourself. And it's really, I think everybody has noticed, maybe it's online, when you see major articles now in the New York Times, Washington Post, you'll see grammatical mistakes that their editors or the New Yorker, you can see that we don't have people who are skilled. I can tell from copy editing from books that I write compared to 20 years ago even. And that reflects the decline in the University of Humanity. Why did it decline? Originally, it declined because we adopted the German system of doctoral programs. To get a PhD or an EDD meant you were going to either train people in the university or you were going to train or organize K through 12 as your doctorate in education. But under the PhD system, the more specialized you became, the more your thesis, which was required, would be immune from criticism. So you didn't write a thesis in my field on triremes of the ancient world, because it's a pretty big but important about ships.
Right.
You wrote a thesis on how long was the oar of the Athenian trireme, and then you said, nobody knows it like I do, and you were immune, but then that took a life of its own. So we created all the specialists and a specialist vocabulary. And the professors, if you were a classics professor or a German professor, and you knew you had been trained, it was very easy to teach a graduate class with 5 people about how long the trireme was,
Right.
the or was. It was hard for you to go back and use that skill to teach beginning Greek, and yet you should have had the most knowledge. Instead, we had graduate students with the least amount of knowledge teaching Introduction to Western Civ or history when we should have had these widely published. But the idea was we're going to give them more release time, less teaching, so they can write more specialized articles to be more authorities. And we started to deprecate people who were what we called generalists or
right.
native historians. So
Right.
we didn't create a Prescott or a Parkman or a Gibbon.
Right.
But we, it was no longer a history of the English-speaking people. And people who did that today, Andrew Roberts or Neil Ferd, we deprecate it sometimes. So then there was a reaction against that. Let's make it more relevant. But we went, as typical Americans, from attacking academic manderism and specialism to hardcore politicalization and weaponization. In other words, we didn't say, we want a populist humanities that encourages everybody, Hispanic, Black, old, young, conservative, liberal, to have some common core of knowledge so they can get along with each other and they're on the same page. And we want all the full professors and all the down professors to teach these introductory classes and to be judged for tenure and promotion on how well they teach, as well as these specialist articles. And a great book, like Dawn to Decadence, or a book like Andrew Roberts' recent biography of Napoleon should be in itself grounds for tenure. Or Paul Ray's Republics Ancient and Modern.
Right.
And either that or a great teacher. But instead we said, no, the people that gets the most grants, the most narrow awards, or the most specialized academic, the experts. And so people didn't get good teaching, and there was no advocates for it. And they didn't realize that they were dying on the vine, that the more that they specialized and got narrow, the discipline started to shrink. And then when people came in and said, everybody should teach introductory courses, everybody should write things to the public, write specialized, that's fine, but write stuff for people to understand. And get out in the community and bring in PhDs that worked as mechanics. Or if you see a guy who's applying and he's got a PhD at 40 because he was in the military for 20 years, that's not something you feel is a negative, it's a positive.
Right.
So we didn't do that. And so 30 years ago, we brought in the weaponization of the curriculum. And this was the Foucault, Derrida, Lacan. We're going to use the humanities in kind of a suicidal, narcissistic, nihilistic fashion to go back, and history's not going to be tragic. We're going to pick winners and losers in this quasi-Marxist binary. So Penelope, the heroine of the Odyssey, is not just there. She's an abused woman, just like in today, and we have this narcissistic, high testosterone Odysseus, and he's sleeping with Calypso and Circe, and she's being cheated on, and she doesn't know anything about emancipation, so she's playing along with this, and he takes us, and before you know it, it has nothing to do with the beauty or the tragedy of the Odyssey. And then we would go and say, the real hero of the Medea is Medea, because she's the first feminine. There's elements of that in the play, but she kills her children. My God. So we take every piece of literature, our history, and we try to say, these are the good people,
Right. Put it
and
through
these
that
are the
lens.
bad guys,
Right.
and our job is not tragedy, it's therapy. And I'm going to, and that just, the students are just going, they do not want to go to class at 18 and be given Dante's Inferno or Machiavelli or Shakespeare and told that this person is a phallocentric, racist, homophobic, transphobic model, and he's horrible, and you shouldn't have to read this type of literature. And the West is, and everybody said, well, if the West is so bad, and it's not better than the alternative, why take it? And so people that should have been advocates for their own discipline And the most famous is I just reviewed an article by I won't mention his name, by a prominent Princeton classicist, and he and others say we should not study Greek and Latin at all. They're not necessary for classics, and we should create a new Afro-Caribbean classics because the West is no better. Well, everybody knows that's false because everybody wants to come to a Western country. They're not going to. It doesn't mean you're chauvinistic about it, but the West, with its history back to antiquity and the Judeo-Christian empirical enlightened tradition, it creates the greatest level of prosperity, security, fairness. It's not perfect, it's self-correcting.
Mm-hmm.
So when they have these human pathologies like sexual chauvinism or slavery, it corrects in a way that other societies don't to the same degree. And people know that no matter where they're from. So most of the people trying to get into the United States today are not from a Western country as we used to define it. They're from Asia or Africa, but they aspire to be secure, free, prosperous. So they go to a Europe or the United States. And yet we, as the custodians, have lost confidence, and we say to them, well, we're not going to impose our views on you. And they're saying to you, I want you to impose your views because I'm escaping from the antithesis.
Right.
Well, you may be escaping it, but we're a terrible, sexist, racist, capitalist, greedy. Well, why did I come?
Right.
Well, you don't have to buy into this lie. You can just have your own little cadre, and you'll be, and then the subtext is, but you will be secure and prosperous and free because of the Western tradition, but we're not allowed to say that. So that's, put that all together, and the humanities are dying, and we're going to be worse off as a society for that loss.
Well, Victor, I think we'll bring it to a close there, but it's on a poignant note because I think what is a through line through these 3 episodes has been the importance of seeing citizenship like stewardship. That we are actually being given something that we need to be very mindful about what we're passing on. Yeah. And certainly that's what we're teaching at the policy school at Pepperdine, but the importance of understanding the American founding in that context as well, that the founders understood that really the only mindset that could overcome the examples of Rome, Sparta, Athens, that had come apart in a very short period of time. Their greatest fear in many ways was that this American republic would not last. But the only way that it would depend on the virtue of its citizens and also leaders.
Yeah, I think that's, in closing, I would I would say that it's very important to have a humble view of your unique circumstance of being born an American. And the legacy and what people who died on Okinawa or died at Gettysburg gave us. And to keep in mind, you don't have to be perfect to be good. All you have to do is be far better than the alternative. And that should be imbued to all Americans, the value of citizenship, and not to deprecate it, and to have some thanks. I think Aristotle, he said courage is the most important of all virtues, but also gratitude. We don't have any gratitude. We always condemn people of the past and apply our particular set of virtues, or good and bad, in this context. And we go back and then we say, history is melodrama. Oh, he was unkind to this person because of race or sex. And we condemn them, and we never think, my gosh, they lived to be about 45. If they had a little tumor, they were dead. If they had diabetes, they were dead. They came across the plains and were killed. We don't give them any credit anymore. And I think that reflects poorly on us. We've got to refashion that idea that we're very, very lucky to live here, and we have an obligation to pass on something better than what we inherited.
Well, Victor, I'll speak for all the viewers and say that we're very grateful for you. And I'm very grateful as Dean of the Policy School for your involvement in what we're doing to prepare future leaders, and very excited about this video series and what I know so many are going to learn. So this will conclude the last of our three-part series, What the Ancients Taught the Founders. I want to thank all of you for joining us for this series. If you're not subscribed to the School of Public Policy YouTube channel to hear all of the or see all the great work that we're doing at the School of Public Policy, including other lectures and discussions with Dr. Hanson, I hope you will tap on that subscribe button. Otherwise, I hope you'll share these videos with friends and family in your networks, especially as we journey toward this all-important 250th anniversary of this exceptional country. So from Malibu, California, and the School of Public Policy at Pepperdine University, thanks so much for joining us.